Be careful how you treat people, especially those of the household of faith. You never know who God may use to speak life, to speak a blessing, to help, to be a voice into your life in that season. I recall some years ago, just a young preacher, putting on my first conference. And as people were coming in, I was greeting everyone. And there was an individual lady that came in. And as I was approaching her, I extended my hand to greet her. And she tooted up her nose and ran around me and didn't say a word and went into the sanctuary and took her seat. I quickly brushed it off because I didn't know the lady. I didn't know what was going on in her life. But for a moment, it did hurt, but I didn't take offense to it. And so as service went on, I found out that she had come to hear the guest speaker. And so after he spoke and before he dismissed, I got up to thank him and his family and those that came out to be a part of the service. And right there, in the midst of me thanking the guest speaker, God begins to speak prophetically to me. And I began to pause and stop and begin to receive the download spiritually. And as he began to speak, I began to speak. And I pointed to the lady, not out of my flesh, not out of anger, not out of a spirit of offense, because it was because God had said her, and he pointed like he was like leaning me toward her. And the Lord began to speak these words, and I said, the Lord began to tell me to declare this over your life. You shall live and not die. You shall live and not die. And she kind of looked at me, and kind of just like lifted her hands like, okay, this is one of these moments I just take this word, okay, and just kind of like to me, like she brushed it off. And after the service, she didn't say anything. She went and spoke to the speaker and spoke to a few other people, and she left. I didn't think, much about it. I had a conversation with a few people about it, but nevertheless, it wasn't anything that I held against her. About a year later, God moves us to another location in another city, on a bigger location, bigger church. And one of the ministers come and he said, "You remember that mother that came to your conference?" I was like, "Yeah." He said, "She told me to tell you that she's coming. She's on the way. That it is very important that she speaks to you." And I said, "Okay." In the back of my mind, I'm thinking, "Okay, what is this? Is this going to be another encounter?" I didn't know what it was. And so before service starts, she comes through the door. She see me, I see her, and she began to rush over to me. And she began to say, man of God, thank you, man of God." And she began to hug me and squeeze me. And, like she knew me, very different from the last encounter that I had with her. And she began to hug me like family. And she said, "Man of God, I want to thank you. You're a true, real man of God. Thank you, thank you, thank you." She said, "Let me tell you." She said, "Not long," and she looked a little different. She was smaller. I could tell she had lost some weight. And she said, "Man of God, I want to tell you, not long after you released that prophetic word over my life," she said, "I was at home by myself." And she said, "I began to have some chest pain." And she said, "Only thing I know, I couldn't move." And she said, "Everything started going dark." And she said, right there in the midst of everything that was happening, she said, "I began to hear your voice. Out of all of the preachers that I know, all the ministers that I know, and prayer warriors that I know, she said, it was only your voice that I kept hearing. I kept hearing, I shall live and not die. She said, in the spirit. And she said, I couldn't say much of anything. And she said, something began to tell me, repeat what the voice that you was hearing, repeat the voice. And she said, I began to start repeating what you had spoke to me that night. I shall live and not die. Lo and behold, she found out that she was having a heart attack and she wasn't supposed to survive it. But she said during that moment, she said only thing that she could hear and the only thing that she could say was, I shall live and not die. She said, man of God, I want to tell you, thank you for being obedient to God. She says, I want to support you. She says, I want to do what I can. And she said, I see God doing great things, in this ministry and in your life. I say that to say this. Be careful how you treat people. You don't never know who God will use to speak life into you. You don't know who God will use to be a blessing to you, to be a help to you, to be a covering for you. Be careful how you treat people, especially those of the household of faith.